All right, hello everybody and welcome back to the second channel. We're back again with 4 works submitted by you. So we're going to go ahead and get started here in just a second, but as always I want to read off this. Keep in mind, I am not a professional reviewer. I'm just some guy on the internet who likes reading and writing. The opinions expressed in this video are only opinions. My interpretation of or reaction to the work will not be the same as everyone else's, for better or for worse. I will look for the good and the bad, but no matter what I say, don't be too hard on yourself, just keep writing. And for those in the comments, please be respectful. Also, I'm so sorry for any mistakes or mispronunciations of names or words. If I come across a word that I don't want to say for whatever reason, I will replace it with the word blank. So, we're going to start with some poems submitted by one of my patrons. They go by Zagreus. So we have 9 poems here. Something I will point out, if y'all haven't noticed, when I get work from patrons, I do kind of like a limit of 9 poems. When I get poems from non-patrons, I'll do, 3 or 4, depending on the length, So we have 9 poems here from Zagreus, and I think that was more by chance than anything else, but there is a content warning here, a few content warnings in order of how they appear in the poems. So we have violent language, a lesbian slur, material related to politics, food and animal abuse. Okay, so keep those things in mind as we go through this. Oh, and a note here from the author. I've only been writing poetry about a year, and I lean toward a more simplistic style, very much inspired by dub poetry. Okay, so I looked it up, and correct me if I'm wrong, but what I found was that dub poetry is based on a style of music from Jamaica. I had never heard of it before, actually, which, I don't know, goes to show how much I know in general, but anyway, so thank you for that author's note, though. We'll keep that in mind as we look through these. So this is the first poem, called Them and Me. The world is screaming out for help, and I'm having a cup of tea. The world is burning all around, and I'm watching the telly. All around me people hurt, they writhe in agony. I sit in my room and wallow in gloom, while they cry for unity. I wash the dishes while some have no water. I read the paper that some can't afford. I eat my breakfast, they eat thin air. I write my poems, they say a prayer. They beg me to wake up, they beg me to fight, they beg me to stand up, step into the light. This time I listen, they say, break the restraints. I lift myself and stand up and faint. Okay, interesting. Okay, so we've got some good stuff operating here. A very relatable sentiment in this poem, I'll say that right off the bat, and I'll get more into that as we discuss, but I think the thing that stands out most in terms of devices right away is the rhyme, of course, so we'll take a look at that as we go through it. The world is screaming out for help, and I'm having a cup of tea. I'm having a cup of tea. Just listen to the emphasis of the syllables there. The world is burning all around, and I'm watching the telly. So I don't know. I've read a lot of poetry, right? So this kind of jumped out at me right away. On the second line, the word tea receives the emphasis, right? Cup of tea, cup of tea. But then in the word telly, the part that rhymes with tea, the ly sound, lee, that doesn't receive the emphasis, right? And I'm watching the telly. Te is the part of the word that's receiving that emphasis. And then as we go on, all around me people hurt, they writhe in agony. So once again, the E sound receives the emphasis, right? Agony. The G sound is the unemphasized one in that word. I sit in my room and wallow in gloom while they cry for unity. So same as agony, unity, where 3-syllable word, emphases at the beginning and the end, right? So telly is kind of the odd one out here in terms of the rhyming sound receiving the emphasis, which isn't like necessarily bad, but and a lot of readers probably wouldn't even pick up on it, but if you're like me, it did sort of stand out here in this first stanza. It's still an effective rhyme if you ask me. I think tea, telly, agony, unity, those are pretty good, pretty unique, I think. So not a huge deal, honestly, just kind of something I noticed as I read along there. Moving on, I wash the dishes while some have no water. I read the paper that some can't afford. I eat my breakfast, they eat thin air. I write my poems, they say a prayer. So the rhyme scheme has changed in this stanza, right? Really the only rhyme I think we have here is air and prayer, right? Unless we count maybe water or paper as having that same ER sound at the end, in which case paper is kind of a slant rhyme. Paper, air, prayer. Yeah, more or less. So I guess my question would be like, is there a real purpose in having changed the rhyme scheme? What effect does that have on the work as a whole? That would just be my question. And maybe the answer is no. And if so, it might be worth keeping the rhyme scheme consistent throughout the whole thing. But if there is a purpose, then, maybe I'm just missing it, right? So just some things to consider. They beg me to wake up, they beg me to fight, they beg me to stand up, step into the light. This time I listen, they say break the restraints. I lift myself up and stand up and faint. So as far as sentiment, right, sorry, I wasn't moving the poem. I apologize. As far as sentiment, like I said, there is a relatable feeling to this poem because it's about, everything that's happening in the world and this privilege that the speaker has that maybe they feel they don't deserve, right? It's kind of like survival's guilt, where you're in a life-threatening experience and somebody loses their life, but you keep yours and you kind of wonder why, right? And I think worldwide we're really seeing that right now, where it's like, why was I born into my circumstances versus these people who are suffering, right? Is it all just random? Do I have a responsibility to all those people who are suffering? So I think these are important topics and important questions that the poem is grappling with. And that's one of the best things about poetry, right, is that it helps us grapple with these topics that are hard for us to confront. So this was actually a pretty helpful read for me, I'm not going to lie. The message comes across well, and I think there's a nice kind of little twist at the end where the speaker does ultimately decide, they'll fight, they'll do something for somebody less fortunate than them. But once they try, it seems they're incapable, right? That's what I gathered from the whole fainting, right? And it is easy to feel like incapable during these times right now. So I would say this is very effective personally, very relatable. And the author mentioned that they use a simplistic style, which is, totally fine. Like, whatever your style is, just make it your own, right? And the fact that it comes across is great. I've said before, I do enjoy typically poems that kind of have like a lot going on and maybe are even a little bit cryptic, but that's really just a matter of personal preference, right? Just because this poem's a little more upfront with what it's saying, that doesn't make it bad by any means. I don't know that I have more to say on this one besides just, thinking about the rhyme scheme and what that is actually lending to the work overall. But otherwise, this was a good one. So moving on. Tearing pictures off the walls. I want to write upon the walls and doodle lots of things, to free my ramblings from their prison, create some inky veins, my brain unraveled textually, and little scribbles of things that rattle inside my noggin and climb and scratch and swing. I want to free the nonsense and let the chaos loose. The world was made for scribbling, I just need an excuse. That's pretty fun. That actually, to me, kind of has a Shel Silverstein quality. Let's see, what's this rhythm we're working with? Let me count some syllables real quick. I want to write upon the walls and doodle lots of things. Okay, I thought so, yeah. So it has that sound to it where it alternates between lines of 8 syllables and 6 syllables. And often we call this a 14er, right? Because that's 14 syllables altogether. So just listen, right? I want to write upon the walls and doodle lots of things, to free my ramblings from their prison, create some inky veins. Now you'll notice this line did have 9 syllables, but the 9th syllable was unstressed, so it doesn't actually sound very egregious when read like that. So this is something Emily Dickinson would use a lot, right? And this really has like a Dickinson quality to it, where things and veins, that's really a slant rhyme at best. And Dickinson loved to indulge in 14ers with slant rhymes or sometimes no rhymes, right? So that's pretty cool. As far as what else we've got going on here, I want to write upon the walls and doodle lots of things to free my ramblings from their prison, create some inky veins. Okay, yeah, I did have this thought while we were reading, where I feel like the metaphors might be getting a little bit mixed, a little bit lost even, but let's keep going. My brain unraveled textually and little scribbles of things. My brain unraveled textually and little scribbles of things that rattle inside my noggin and climb and scratch and swing. So this to me was the moment especially where I felt like the metaphors were sort of getting lost. Like, what's doing the climbing and scratching and swinging? Is it the speaker themselves? Is it this rattling? Is it the brain itself? I felt like we sort of lost the threads of clarity there. It does still sound pretty good though. It's when you do a 14er correctly, even when you take a tiny bit of liberty and do some lines with 9 syllables or 7, or mess with the stresses here and there a little bit, it still has a uniform sound to it, right? And I think we see that in this poem. I want to free the nonsense and let the chaos loose. The world was made for scribbling. I just need an excuse. So, frankly, I really like, again, the sentiment of this poem, where it's just that need to create, right? I feel that all the time. I'm sure a lot of us do. And, we express our creativity in different ways. I'm sure for a lot of us, watching this video, it's through writing or drawing, right? Like scribbling, doodling, right? It kind of makes the title interesting, tearing pictures off the walls. I think there's sort of a layer there. I don't often pay too much attention to the title of a poem because, for me, this is where the fun of the poem is for the most part. But oftentimes the title does add something to the body of the work itself. And so it sounds, like the speaker wants to put pictures on the walls, and yet the title is tearing pictures off the walls. So does that suggest, you have to tear something down in order to create something new? I think there are a lot of implications there that are kind of interesting to think about. Overall, this is a good poem. It reads well. Like I said, hard to go wrong with a 14er when you are, paying attention to how your syllables are being distributed. Yeah, like I said, the one thing would just sort of be, where are the metaphors? Where are they starting? Where are they being pulled through? What is referring to what here in this work? So that's what I'll leave the author to consider, but that's a fun read. I like that one a lot. I think with a tiny bit of revision, that one will be basically perfect, as close to perfect as possible. Excuse me. All right, this next one is called The Smile. You smiled at me. For Pete's sake. Where did all go wrong? I didn't shave. I wore my pins. Oh, this is bloody wrong. My hair's untidy, my boots are muddy, my jeans are scuffed and stained. I got a t-shirt on offensive to sight. But all of that's in vain. Because you smiled at me, you fucking prick. You ruined me, rough, blank image. I'm supposed to shock and intimidate the members of this village. Give me a blank stare any day. I'm trans and punk and terribly gay. Go on, frown at least a little. I know the smile was non-committal. Aren't I at least a little bit strange? Oh, fuck it. I'll just go home and change. Okay, this has a fun tone to it. We'll just take it little by little. You smiled at me for Pete's sake. Where did all go wrong? I didn't shave. So again, slant rhyme with sake and shave is pretty good. I wore my pins. Oh, this is bloody wrong. My hair's untidy. My boots are muddy. Okay. So I guess the rhyme is just slightly unclear. It's kind of inconsistent, I guess. Like untidy and muddy rhyme a little bit, right? But in the first 4 lines, we have sake and shave, which is a slant rhyme, right? But the structure it's not the same, right? We have line 2 and line 4 sharing a rhyme, sort of. It's a slant rhyme, right? For all I know, it could have been unintended. But then we have line 5, 6, 7, and 8 untidy and muddy, sharing a slant rhyme. And again, maybe that was unintentional. And so, it's possible to read these first 8 lines without any rhyme at all. And so when the rhyme does eventually come in, it's almost a little bit jarring, but not without purpose. Let's see. Let's keep reading and we'll see what we might uncover. My jeans are scuffed and stained. I got a t-shirt. Yeah, this line read as a little bit awkward to me. I got a t-shirt on offensive to sight. Like, is on supposed to be there? I feel like it would read better if it were just, I got a t-shirt offensive to sight. I feel like that's what it's supposed to say, but I don't know for sure. I can't say. But all of that's in vain. So stained in vain is the rhyme there, right? Because you smiled at me, you fucking prick, you ruined my rough blank image. So this is kind of where the humor comes in, where it's like, this person is trying to convey a certain image. They're trying to do an outward performance of a certain type, but then the subject smiles at them and then the image sort of fades. The facade sort of slips away. And I think that's funny. And how many of us haven't been in that situation before, right? Where we're trying to put up some kind of front, but then somebody does something and you lose it entirely. What I think of, which is similar, is sort of like, we're in a bad mood and we want to, really just be in a bad mood for a little while, but then somebody does something funny and you just can't help it anymore, right? This feels similar, but this is more like in a romantic sense. But anyway, keep going. I'm supposed to shock and intimidate the members of this village. Give me a blank stare any day. I'm trans and punk and terribly gay. Go on, frown at least a little. I know the smile was non-committal. Aren't I at least a little bit strange? Oh, fuck it. I'll just go home and change. So I actually like these couplets a lot, and I almost wish the whole poem were just written in these couplets, personally. I don't know. That's just my personal preference. I am a couplet guy at heart. I like little and committal, especially. That's a good rhyme. Yeah, I don't know if I've heard that one before. Excuse me. And I kind of like these 2 lines as well, where it says, I'm supposed to shock and intimidate the members of this village. The word village kind of like harkens back to medieval times or a fantasy setting almost. And that kind of adds to this speaker and their desired monstrous look, right? It almost sounds like, they're comparing themselves to like a dragon or an ogre maybe, just with that diction, which I think is kind of neat and could maybe even be built upon. I don't know. We do have Shrek already, so, I don't know that we need a poem that's just Shrek. That's not a one-to-one, but there's a lot of good going on here. Again, I just sort of question the rhyme, how it intermingles with the structure, like the consistency of it. That's all I'm trying to say. But there is a good sound once the rhyme picks up in the couplets especially, and in a couple other areas of the poem. And like I said, it has a funny charm to it, right? So very good tone. Way to make it your own, right? All right, we've got some shorter poems on this page. This one is called Bare Arms, or Bare Arms. Anyway, right to bare arms, you'll look silly with those, and the bears need them back. They can't pick their nose. Again, that also feels very kind of Shel Silverstein. It's just funny. I don't know if I have much more to say besides I think it's funny. Obviously, it's a play on the language in the Second Amendment. And, you could read a deeper meaning even, like, you look silly with those. Like, haven't we all seen those people who are a little bit too eager to, like, show off their guns? And it really does just look silly, right? I don't know. I think that's on initial reading, the only deeper sentiment I can kind of pull from this, especially in relation to the subject matter of the Second Amendment. But anyhow, it's just funny, right? Again, there's a charm to it, so I like it. Yeah, I don't know if I have more to say there. I'd keep it. I'm a fan. This next one is called Contradictions. I met a socialist. He didn't like people. I met a communist who lived alone. I met a punk who loved authority, and a primitivist with a telephone. I met a Christian who hated their neighbor and a Tory who longed for change. I met a liberal with strong opinions. People can be quite strange. Interesting. Okay. So I have a few thoughts, but let's start with this. Again, there's a charm here. This is obviously meant to be rather funny, right? And that's not to say it isn't saying something a little bit profound, but on its surface, it kind of reads like a joke, right? Like, I met a communist who lived alone. That's funny. That's just, it lives up to the title of the poem. A punk who loved authority, again, just kind of a funny visual, and a primitivist with a telephone. Sorry, let me take a look at the syllables here real quick. I met a socialist, he didn't like people. I don't know if there's anything particular going on there, but it reads well. That's what I was mostly getting at. I met a Christian who hated their neighbor. That feels very common these days. Okay, yeah, one thing I wanted to note. If it wasn't clear from the previous poems, it seems like our writer, is from the UK, right? They're talking about Tories. In a previous poem, they used the word bloody. I apologize, guys. Anyway, so I am not an expert on geopolitics in the slightest, or rather on the politics within each country. So maybe liberal means something different in the UK than it does here in the US. But I would think most liberals here in the United States definitely have strong opinions. So that, to me, as an American reader, doesn't read like a contradiction in the way that pretty much all these other ones do, right? So that's really my only thing here. Otherwise, like I said, I think it just has a funny charm to it. And at the same time, it's, revealing something that's really quite true about most people, is that we tend to be hypocrites, right? We tend to contradict ourselves in one way or another. So, pretty good. I don't have much more to say there on that one. Next one is called Curse. I have a curse. How did it come to be? Did I anger an ancient wizard or step on a magic bee? Did a wicked witch make a potion? Did I buy an evil ring? Or could it be even worse? What if I didn't do anything? That's fun. I like that a lot. I laughed, I think, in particular at the visual of stepping on a magic bee. These other ones are almost like kind of cliches, which I honestly think kind of serves the poem more, that they are cliches. I'll maybe touch more on that in a second. But we have an ancient wizard, a potion, an evil ring, and then a magic bee. That it sounds made up, right? Like, I don't know, maybe that's an expression in some part of the world, or a fantasy cliche. But I just like it. I think it's funny. I think the fact that this speaks to cliches just kind of emphasizes the point at the end, where it's like, you expect a curse, you expect bad luck because you did something, right? And especially something, that you've read about before, or that's happened to somebody else before, in stories, right? You angered a wizard or a witch, or you picked up a cursed object. But worse than that would be the idea that you have bad luck, or that bad things happen to you for no reason at all, right? I think as humans, we want there to be explanations for things, especially for bad things, right? I think maybe that's one of the reasons we write poetry in the first place, is sort of to rationalize bad things that happen in our minds. Not always, but sometimes, right? And so to think that bad things might happen for no reason, that's kind of horrifying, right? So I like that this poem touches on that deeper idea in very simple and a little bit cliched terms, right? Pretty good. This last one on this page is called Dinner. I sat down for dinner while a man sat outside my door. I don't tend to think we're rich, but we're not exactly poor. Because while I ate my frozen pizza out there in the cold, that poor man's eating months-old bread and picking at the mold. Yeah, again, pretty straightforward with its meaning, right? I sat down for dinner while a man sat outside my door. I don't tend to think we're rich, but we're not exactly poor. Because while I ate my frozen pizza out there in the cold, that poor man's eating months-old bread and picking at the mold. Yeah, I mean, I reread it because it's not like there's much I can say to add depth to, the literal mechanics of the poem, of what's going on here. It reminds me, I was at a poetry reading recently, and somebody got up, the bookstore owner actually, and he read a poem that he'd been working on about his daughter and this boy. Let me say, I don't know if any of this was even real. It might have been a fictional poem for all we know, right? But the poem was about his daughter and this boy who showed her a snuff movie, and she looked away the whole time. And excuse me, up to that point in the poem, it kind of seemed like you were really supposed to dislike this boy, right? Because he showed the daughter a snuff movie and she didn't want to see it, of course. But then there was this unexpected shift where the boy is drinking a Diet Coke from 7-Eleven, and the speaker, the writer, reveals that that's his dinner for the evening. And so it's like, it makes you think, what were the boy's circumstances, right? It doesn't justify what he did, but it kind of makes you realize, it's not like he's pure evil either. He's going through his own stuff, right? And so that I think is at the heart of what this poem is getting at. And it's similar to, I think, the first poem we read, where it causes us to reflect on our privilege and what we're doing for other people. And I think maybe the author could go deeper with this idea, because, look, I hate to say it, right? But I think a lot of people, when we see, somebody who's homeless, I think our immediate inclination is a negative one. I think we have that implicit bias within us, right? And then maybe some of us who are, a little more empathetic, we kind of kick ourselves for thinking so negatively and remind ourselves that they didn't choose to be in that circumstance, and that there's more going on that we don't realize, right? So I think maybe that could be the journey of this poem. I think that would create an even deeper emotional effect personally, if the speaker saw this man outside the door, and initially if the speaker looked on them with like reproach or with a little bit of maybe even disgust, but then it shifts to the last two lines as they're currently written, where we see the man eating very old bread and having to remove the mold from it. I think that would just make those lines hit all the harder personally, an even stronger shift in this poem. So that's my 2 cents there. And, it still reads very well. I think it still accomplishes what it sets out to do, assuming I know it's doing what it's setting out to do. But yeah, anyway. Excuse me again. Sorry, everyone. Yeah, I'll leave it with that thought there. So I think we have 2 more poems here from this author. We'll start with this one called My Friend. I met a fox in the forest. Her name was Madeline. She told me she was in danger, and there was very little time. She said that men had caught her and put her in a cage and let her loose elsewhere in this grand wooden maze. I asked her why they'd done this. She said she didn't know. I asked her what to do. She said we should go. For those men now were chasing, riding on horseback, following some chained dogs, ready and primed for attack. I gave her a fuss and said I'd only slow her down. Besides, these men need stopping. I'm ready to stand my ground. And as she fled behind me, I heard the growls and snarls, and hooves impacting the undergrowth. I stood on my guard. I met a fox in the forest. Her name was Madeline. I only knew her briefly, but now she's a friend of mine. And I'm not sure what will happen, but I'll fight to keep her free. And the men that want to kill her will have to get through me. That's, again, initial reaction is just like, how cute, right? And I've said this before on this channel, but like, when I use cute to describe a poem, it's never like in a condescending way, not at all. Again, it has a charm to it, as pretty much all of these poems have had from this author. It has a charm, and it has a lovely message, like, wow. Sorry, I'm going to take a sip of water real quick, but then we'll get into it a little bit more. Okay. Thanks for bearing with me and my dry cough here, everyone. So, one thing I'll say is I'm pretty sure it's pronounced Madeline, and I said Madeline, so sorry about that. But that obviously makes the rhyme work a little bit more. I met a fox in the forest. Her name was Madeline. She told me she was in danger, and there's very little time. One thing, really the only thing I want to point out about this, otherwise I think it's really quite good. Again, like, this one is sort of reminiscent of Shel Silverstein, perhaps only in the sense that, like, it's a poem for all ages, right? Yeah, might get more into that in a minute. But yeah, one thing I want to point out is there's this consistent rhythm and rhyme only up until a certain point, right? So I met a fox in the forest. Her name was Madeline. She told me she was in danger and there's very little time. One thing to point out. Maybe you want to add some quotation marks and make some of this dialogue that could potentially make the poem that much more engaging. So instead of she told me she was in danger, right? She told me, quote, I'm in danger and there's very little time, end quote. I think that could potentially elevate what you've already got here, but up to you. It still reads pretty well. Anyway, she said that men had caught her and put her in a cage and let her loose elsewhere in this grand wooded maze. I asked her why they'd done this. She said she didn't know. I asked her what to do. She said we should go. Again, would be good to have quotes there and there. But as you can see, a pretty consistent rhythm and rhyme up to that point, right? But then it goes on. For those men now were chasing, riding on horseback, following some chained dogs, ready and primed for attack. There's a subtle change there. I can see the rhyme scheme is still the same, but the syllables don't quite follow as they did previously. Let's see if we can take a look at how many syllables we're actually working with. So first 4 lines, I met a fox in the forest. Her name was Madeline. So it sounds like another 14er, right? She told me she was in danger and there's very little time. So again, a 14er, even though this line has 7 syllables, it still reads as a 14er. But down here, what have we got working with? For those men now were chasing, so that's 7 syllables, riding on horseback, 5 syllables, following some chained dogs, ready and primed for attack. So it's okay to play with a 14er structure for sure, which is what's happening in these 4 lines, but there might be a little bit too much manipulation going on here because it just reads a little bit differently. How could we alter it? Let's think about that for a second. Those men now were chasing. Those men now were chasing. You could say instead, for those men now were chasing us. So that brings you to 8 on that line. Riding on their horses' backs. That was 7 syllables. Riding on horseback. Because it's about the emphasis, right? And the stresses. Hang on one second. Riding on their horses' backs. So with that, you at least get the emphasis on the word backs, right? Following some chained dogs. Chained you almost want to read like chained, right? Because otherwise it just doesn't quite flow correctly. Following some chained dogs, right? Following some chained dogs, because chained and dogs are both being emphasized, and so it feels like there should be an unstressed syllable between them. Ready and primed for attack. Anyway, I've spent so much time on these 4 lines, I apologize for that. Let's keep going and see how it goes from there. I gave her a fuss, so again, we've kind of lost the 14er structure, that one is too short, and said I'd only slow her down. At the same time, this kind of marks a shift. But yeah, anyway, next line again, this is a place where you could add dialogue, and said I'll only slow you down. Besides, these men need stopping. I'm ready to stand my ground. So those 4 lines altogether read a little bit better than the previous 4 lines. I gave her a fuss. See, yeah, okay, so if you were to put on this one line, I gave her a fuss and said, so move these two words up to this line, I'd only slow her down. I think that's what you want to keep it more consistent. Anyway, besides these three men need stopping, I'm ready to stand my ground. And as she fled behind me, I heard the growls and snarls, and hooves impacting the undergrowth. I stood on my guard. Let's see. And hooves impacting the undergrowth. So 9 syllables, but it still fits if you ask me, just based on the... You could probably remove the word and here. Oh my gosh, I haven't kept the camera with it. I'm so sorry, you guys. Yeah, you could potentially remove this word and it would still read the same, or maybe even better. Let's see. I heard the growls and snarls, hooves impacting the undergrowth. I stood on my guard. Yeah, I think that reads better without the word and. In fact, one thought I had while reading, the word and is used to start a lot of the lines in this poem. So that's just one thing to consider breaking, just to keep things kind of fresh with each line, right? And that's... Sorry. That's something I do all the time in my poetry, is I start lines with the word and, like, over and over again. So that's one thing I'm conscious of a lot in poems I read and write. But anyway, last stanza. I met a fox in the forest. Her name was Madeline. I only knew her briefly, but now she's a friend of mine. Again, like if you cut the word but, it might flow just slightly better. I only knew her briefly. Now she's a friend of mine. I think just cutting that one syllable makes it flow just a tiny bit better. And now I'm not sure what will happen, but I'll fight to keep her free, and the men who want to kill her will have to get through me. Those 4 lines read very well. Anyway, so yeah, I would just reconsider some of the syllabic stresses and syllabic numberings on some of these lines, and then also, of course, the repeated use of the word and maybe the word but. No, not quite as much. Mostly the word and. But I like the message a lot. I also mentioned considering adding dialogue, as that might make it slightly more engaging. But yeah, overall, I do really like this poem. I like the message. I like the story. Poems that tell a story are often, easy ways to hook an audience, which is great. Last one from this author is called Burning. There's burning in the streets, stay inside, sitting indoors, the walls will rise, flames in the suburbs, deep like blood, brace for impact, silent flood, pretty little boxes riding the waves, hot little boxes, crimson graves. Watch it on the television, stare at your phone, keep yourself occupied, stay at home. Where is your garden now? Where are all the birds? Try to find some comfort in all those empty words. There's burning in the streets, but you stayed in, rectangle eyes, sallow and thin, immersed in the scarlet, tempered by the swell. Comfy in your living room, forever you'll dwell. Yeah, so again, this kind of feels like a poem that's like sort of a call to activism, or sort of a poem of shame, where it's like we should feel ashamed of ourselves for doing nothing in the face of tragedy, right? Or injustice. There's a lot of cool symbolism going on here. Imagery too. Let's take a look in just a sec. Sorry. So obviously, the main symbol here is the burning in the streets. We could take that to mean fire, literal fire, or maybe it's just really hot in the streets, a la global warming. But anyway, there's burning in the streets, stay inside, sitting indoors. The walls will rise. An interesting symbol. Is that to say, walls of safety, like from inside indoors, or are these like walls of war? So, flames in the suburbs, deep like blood, brace for impact, silent flood. Again, silent flood. It's just an interesting symbol. It could mean a lot of different things, right? And the visual of flames in the suburbs, it sounds like something cataclysmic is happening in a place that would usually be safe. So interesting there. Pretty little boxes riding the waves, hot little boxes, crimson graves. That almost sounds like coffins being swept up in this, quote-unquote flood, which is an interesting visual. Watch it on the television, stare at your phone, keep yourself occupied, stay at home. So again, that idea of injustice, tragedy is happening all around us, but we're safe, right? And so what should we have to do about it? Where is your garden now? Where are all the birds? Try to find some comfort in all those empty words. This kind of reminds me of The Second Coming, a poem by William Butler Yeats, where it's like, calamity is happening and it's not in the way anybody expected it to. So it almost sounds like the person who is watching the television, they're finally being confronted with this burning in the streets, right? And their garden, their birds have been taken, their sanctuary's gone. And maybe there were at one point empty words that they could have found comfort in, but they were empty, right? And they don't mean anything now that the disaster has arrived. There's burning in the streets, but you stayed in. Rectangle eyes. I think this is supposed to say shallow and thin, I assume. Immersed in the scarlet, tempered by the swell. Comfy in your living room, forever you'll dwell. So I don't know, just based on that concluding line, again, those two concluding lines, it sounds like, people who are pampered aren't doing enough for the world. This could even be a call out of the rich specifically, who have the means to help other people but don't. The ultra wealthy, right. So there is a lot at play here. Like I said, a lot of interesting imagery and metaphor, symbolism. It would be interesting to kind of dissect everything going on here. After reading it that second time, it kind of sounds like the flood is a flood of fire, right? Which, again, is an interesting visual. But anyway, this was a good batch of poems. Thank you very much, Zagreus. I think I mentioned that they're a patron of mine, so thank you a ton for your support. Appreciate it a lot. Now let's move on to a little bit of prose. So this submission was like 27 pages of prose, which I'm sorry, I don't have time to do all that. So we're going to read, maybe 5-ish pages here, or 40 minutes worth, maybe, whatever comes first. I don't really have any context. There was a content warning, which was irreality/derealization. This might be like the beginning of a novel, it might be a short story, I'm not entirely sure, we will find out. But the author is named Aabcehmu, so thank you very much for submitting this. Let's take a look. Dark, light, dark, light, dark, light. It's blinding at first, your ears are ringing, your nose is burning, and your mouth is full of copper taste. You can't feel anything except the pins and needles all over your body. Okay, so pretty good hook right off the bat. I will say I also like this symbol. It kind of looks like, is it a loading symbol? Is it meant to be the sun? So that's kind of interesting. So this is a neat way to start the story. And we're working in second person here, which is also pretty interesting. An image briefly flashes through your mind's eye, vast and intricate, too quickly for you to really process it, and in its wake, the painfully overwhelming sensations fade, replaced by shapes of gentle color, green and blue and brown. The air is sweet and fresh, the ground underneath you is soft and tickles with blades of grass. There is a whisper of wind and the rustling of tree branches above you. As your vision resolves into proper focus, you see that you're lying in the shade beneath a lone tree, standing tall on the top of a hill in the middle of a grassy field. The pain is already fading from memory, not forgotten but safely isolated from undesired recollection by the succor of this pleasant resting place. That reads well. I like the sound of that a lot. You just lie there for a long while, staring into the gently waving leaves overhead, but eventually you can feel restlessness build in your muscles, and then a desire to get up and move. In that moment, two things happen simultaneously. You realize that your body is not obeying you, and your body undergoes a brief spasm which, while neither intense nor painful, is still rather discomforting as it rolls through each and every muscle in your body, including the weird internal ones you don't tend to think about. Fortunately, after that's over, your body appears to be under your control, maybe even more so than feels intuitively normal. I would just make that a period rather than a question mark. Just make the narrator sound a little more sure of themselves. If they're a third-person omniscient narrator, right? The muscle's presence is not as disconcertingly obvious as when they spasmed, but seemingly all the muscles in your body are at your command. You think you could even tell your heart to stop beating if you ever wanted to, though it unfortunately requires no conscious effort to continue beating. Somehow you're able to shove that experience down beneath the same waterline as the pain that accompanied your initial awakening. You'll probably have to come back and process that later. But for now, you stand up, feeling the grass under the soles of your feet as you get a good stretch. You're barefoot right now, but the light ground is comfortable under your feet, soft and springy without being muddy. You're lightly dressed, a shirt and shorts hanging from you comfortably, rippling as a breeze blows across the ... park space you appear to be in. I understand what's, happening here, literally. And I think I understand the intent, behind putting that ellipses in there. But again, I just feel like the narrator should be more sure of themselves. And again, I understand this is the not the narrator. This is the subject, the you, taking a moment to pause, look around, and then identify this place as a park space that they're in, right? But if you want that effect, I would just sort of enter the thoughts of the subject at that point, rather than having the narrator stumble for a second. And it might be good to, get inside the subject's mind for a minute or have them say something, because this is kind of a long stretch of narration that we've been reading so far. So it could be good to break up that monolithic form that we've seen up to this point, but let's move on. At least that's the vibe you get. The grass is short and even. There aren't any weeds or animals. There's just the one tree. The only thing that's off is that rather than having a park center, a playground, or even just some sidewalks, it's just grass. Endless manicured grass all the way to the horizon. A part of you can't help but wonder who mows all of this, but mostly you are starting to freak out. How did you get here? How are you going to get out of here? I would say in most published works, you don't do two punctuation marks one after the other, so I would just pick question mark or exclamation point. But I do want to point out that was kind of funny for the subject to wonder who mows all the grass in this, expansive void. I like it. Fortunately, these thoughts only have a brief moment to start to spiral before it's halted by another rather surprising event. An angel, or at least someone who looks a lot like one, appears overhead, gliding out from a sort of fold in the sky that you hadn't been able to notice before, not without seeing something emerge from behind it first. Even afterwards, it's hard to identify it. I would just remove the word it there and just say, even afterwards, it's hard to identify, because I think a reader can follow what it is that's being talked about without the word it having to be there. To distinguish it from the rest of the sky, the angel descends towards you. As they get closer, you can make out more of their details. They're a woman, it seems like, with enormous snow-white wings, dark skin and hair, and wearing a light blue dress. "Hey there, you're new, right?" the presumed angel asks, once she's within earshot of you. You're not really sure how to respond, and they land next to you with a look of concern on their face. They wait for a moment longer, but when you fail to say anything, they speak again. "Yeah, you're new, or if you're not, you need some help anyway. You can call me Jaso. Follow me?" They hold out their hand, and you grab it gently, without really thinking. Jaso leads you away, initially just down from the little hill that you woke up on, but then you're moving in a direction you didn't see, away from the endless green grass, and through, you're not exactly sure what. Yeah, again, my recommendation would just be to take away those ellipses. Kind of breaks the momentum a little bit. I was glad to get some dialogue up here. That was a nice break. You think you might be moving through the fourth dimension? Again, no question mark. It feels a bit like what you remember visualizations of what okay, that line reads a little bit awkwardly. It feels a bit like what you remember visualizations of what 4D stuff would be like. Yeah, there's just a lot going on in that sentence. I would just rewrite it as, it feels a bit like what you remember. Hang on. It feels a bit like what 4D stuff would be like, right? Just try to streamline that sentence in whatever way feels right to you. But actually moving through it is really something else. Eventually, after a few minutes of this confusing trek, you manage to ask, "Where are we going?" To get you some help, Jeso replies. I guess that might not really answer your question, but you probably don't have the context to understand exactly what it is. It's not quite like anything back in the Ashes. You might call it an orientation hall, or maybe a tutorial zone, or a prologue, depending on how you look at it. A clinic wouldn't be far either. I don't work there exactly, but I'm associated with them, among many other things. They do good work. Okay, so that's kind of a funny piece of dialogue, because, it sounds like the subject and us, the reader, we're all about to be oriented at once. And so for the speaker here, Jeso, to compare it to like a tutorial, that's kind of funny. Another note on ellipses. In terms of formatting, usually there's a space after you use an ellipses. Some people too will do a space before and after the ellipses, but at least the space after I think you want, just to really separate it from the word that follows. Yeah, looks a little bit too close, but maybe that's just personal preference talking. Anyway. That one question seems to have used up your reserves of verbal strength, so you just nod along to Jeso's explanation. You continue traveling through the shifting multi-dimensional landscape for a little while longer. You close your eyes to avoid the strain of processing everything that's going on around you, or trying to process it anyway, but that just makes you even more aware of the subtle feeling of bending and warping in your own body as Jeso leads you through twists and turns in all sorts of directions. It's stomach churning, but it stops soon enough, prompting you to open your eyes. You're walking on something that actually looks like a path leading up to a building that does, in fact, look quite a bit like a clinic. It's only missing a big red plus or any other obvious signage for that matter. There is still a bit more of a walk, maybe 15 minutes, before the two of you actually pass through the front doors of the facility. We've got a fresh one, Jeso calls out, and there's a sort of fuzzy depth or distorted echo to their voice. It feels like you're missing part of what they said, even though there aren't any gaps in what you heard as far as you can tell. Jeso's words summon a receptionist from behind the desk in the front room of the clinic, who rushes up to you and supports you with an arm under your shoulder. Thanks, Jazz. I'll take it from here. There's a similar sort of multifacetedness to their speech, with the same frustrating feeling of missing something, before they turn to you, speaking more clearly. My name's Meluluke, or Luke for short. Jeso brought you here, to this branch of the refuge, after finding you looking a bit lost in a world fragment near the inner radius. They give you an assessing look for a moment, during which you can see they have a masculine face, with a strong jaw and some stubble, with tan, almost amber skin and hazel eyes. That probably doesn't mean a lot to you right now, but maybe a bit. I can give you the rundown in one of our sitting rooms while Lady finishes lunch. As Luke begins to gently lead you away deeper into the refuge, Jeso gives you some parting words. I'll be around, but Luke, Lady, and the rest of the refuge crew have things well in hand. But if you want to chat, or find yourself interested in my kind of work, just give me a shout. You nod to them, not really sure how else you could respond, and the possibly angel heads Oh, and the possibly angel heads back out the front doors, wings twisting throughout the fourth dimension to avoid getting caught on anything, before taking off and disappearing into another fold in the sky. Again, just kind of funny, kind of charming that, the wing might get caught in this really ethereal kind of plane. One thing about writing material that is so ethereal is that you kind of run the risk of losing your audience a little bit, because obviously these things are hard to describe, right? And if a reader can't place themselves somewhere, they might just, decide it's not worth it, especially at the start of a book like this. That being said, the description of kind of the tree and the very spacious field was, pretty on point, I would say. And sort of just the descriptors since then have been somewhat just hard to pin down, right? And I understand that that's purposeful, but maybe giving just something more for the reader to latch onto in terms of visuals might help ground them, and also gives you a chance as a writer to show off some of your descriptive skills, right? Moving on. The path from the front room to the sitting room is short, but surprisingly twisty. 6 turns from the initial hallway, Luke leads you down. Left, then right, then left, then right, then left, then right. Before finally through a door and into a warmly lit office with a couch, 2 lounge chairs, a desk with its own chair, and a window with closed blinds. Is that left-right thing? Is that a callback to the first part of the story? Let's see. Dark, light, left, then right. Then left, then right. Dark light. It might be. Anyway. Where were we? The decor kind of reminds you of a therapist's office, honestly, which gives you some mixed feelings. Still, once you sit down on the couch, you can feel yourself starting to relax. You built up a lot of tension over the last, half an hour-ish, starting with your aborted panic attack back in that weird infinity park. And even though the walk here wasn't especially rushed, the overwhelming sensory onslaught that accompanied the first legs sort of pushed the tension under the same water that was holding down the pain and worry and something else. The couch underneath you is soft without feeling like it's going to engulf you. The room is a nice, even temperature, and there's just enough of a breeze for the air to not feel stagnant. The lighting isn't dim, but it's gentle enough that when you close your eyes, you don't see anything but darkness. You're comfortable, you think. Let me know when you're ready to talk, Luke asks the non-question as he takes a seat in one of the lounge chairs, and I can get you some water if you're thirsty. Your throat is a bit dry, same. And now that your senses are turned inwards, you feel a bit achy just in general. You nod to Luke as you sprawl out onto the couch, and he turns around to press a finger into the surface of the desk, activating some kind of touch screen, taps it a couple times, and then flicks it before a cubby in the wall opens up, revealing a pack of 6 aluminum cans, simply labeled water, held together with an aluminum yoke rather than a plastic one. He pops one free of the yoke and hands it to you, setting the rest on the desk as the cubby closes back up with a pleasant whoosh. You take the can and pry it open with the tab. It's a surprisingly involved act, now that you're calm enough to pay attention and can feel every little muscle that's involved. It's not uncomfortable, though. It's nice to be able to feel all your bits and pieces working. You sip, and the water is cool and crisp and tastes like spring water, no metallic or plastic taste. You can feel it go all the way down your throat, and not just because you can feel the muscular action of your swallow. You're empty, in a way that you can only just barely remember feeling before, and you are suddenly very grateful that Lady is apparently already preparing some food. You quaff the rest of the can quickly, too quickly to really savor it, but there's 5 more cans to savor, and you are dead fucking thirsty. I sort of question the inclusion of that scene. Seemed a little bit long and sort of a distraction, because at this point as a reader, I'm just wondering what's going on, what is happening to the subject, where are they, how did they get here, that sort of thing. And so for that water scene to just kind of keep going on like that, it just feels like it's keeping me from what I really want as a reader. And that's not to say you have to give all the answers up front. That would be painfully boring, right? But giving those answers little by little, because up to this point, it just kind of feels like I know nothing, right? And I've kind of been reading for a while. And so any any indication that answers are coming, and, just a smidgen of where we are, or just something to latch onto while we're doing this, right? Until we get to more concrete answers. It's a hard thing to do as a writer, I concede. Sort of pulling the sheets back little by little so that your reader eventually gets the full picture. Because mystery is important too, right? But you don't want to drag somebody through a mystery for too long without giving them something to bite onto. But anyway, let's continue. So, do you feel safe enough to start processing the stuff you've been packing away? Probably. This is better than most of the places you've crashed and burned in before, at least. Where have you crashed and burned before, and why? What happened? Where were you before you woke up? A feeling of vertigo washes over you when you try and peer into what suddenly seems like a deep, dark abyss of memory. Your memories of just a few minutes ago are much closer to the surface, so you decide to focus on that for now. The blinding bright, the deafening ring, the numb and burn of your first few seconds of awareness, it's all surprisingly shallow. Recalling it now, it feels almost illusory. More than your other memories even. Meaningless, you discard it for now. Maybe it will turn out to be important, but you're not going to wallow in it. Instead, you move on to your memory of gaining control over your body. It was a bit disturbing as you review it, especially since you have some bad memories about getting sick whenever you felt your insides move. But now it's unobtrusive enough to not be a bother, and having the option to introspect on it is nice. You aren't in a rush to test it, but you get the feeling that if you ever do get sick or get hurt, you'll have a much easier time figuring out what's wrong than you used to. The panic at realizing that you were in some kind of fucked up, maybe inescapable without help park world, that still feels justified, as does your worry about how you got here. You refocus on the present and look to Luke, who is watching you patiently sipping his own can of water. I think, you begin to say, only to realize now that your voice is maybe not unrecognizable, but not what you expected it to be. You aren't even really sure what you were expecting. You sound normal, you guess, but not like yourself somehow. Again, this is just difficult for a reader to latch onto, because it's the only way you can describe this is it is A, but it's also not A at the same time. And that's kind of a difficult descriptor for a reader to latch onto, because it's okay, well, if it's one thing and also not that thing at the same time, it's what am I supposed to make of that? Yeah, I'll leave that out there. Not even really unfamiliar, but just not what you expected your own voice to be like. Kind of like listening to a recording of yourself instead. Without really thinking about it, you flex the muscles in your jaw and throat and bring a hand up to your chin. Then you notice you don't have any facial hair, which gives the same sort of two-faced mixed feelings that the room's decor gave. That in turn makes you realize that you haven't felt your hair at all since you woke up, prompting your other hand to shoot up to the top of your head, only to find it shaved to the skin, with new hair only just barely beginning to poke out of your scalp. That definitely feels wrong, and you can tell that normally you might be on the verge of crying about it, but right now you just don't want to do that. You want to know what the fuck is going on, so instead of crying and sobbing and curling up, you continue to breathe steadily, sit up straight, and speak again. I think I'm ready to talk. Again, I feel very much like the subject, because I also want to know what is going on, and pretty much everything so far just creates more questions than answers, right? So we'll read on just a tiny bit further and see if we can get any answers here. Luke nods as he swallows a mouthful of water. So let's start with where and how you woke up. Jazz gave me an idea of what place you were in. It probably looked like an endless field of fresh-cut grass, right? He pauses, so you answer. Yeah, there was a little hill with a tree on it, too, which I was laying under when I woke up. Right, he says with another nod. I know the type of place. It's one of a few different sorts of places that new folks tend to wash up in, so to speak. But what was waking up there like? You chuckle at that. It was pretty rough, bad at first with really intense. You take a second to recall the right word before continuing. Stimuli. That only lasted a second, though. After that, it wasn't as bad. but I was still sort of paralyzed for a bit, until I had a full body shiver, and now I actually have more control over my body than I think I used to. Anyway, after that I stood up, realized I wasn't anywhere I recognized or that even really seemed possible, and was just about to freak out when Jaso showed up. Then we walked here and met you. Luke continues nodding and takes another sip of water as you explain, then replies, "All right. With all that in mind, I think I can give some additional context about where you woke up and how you ended up there." No question mark, I don't think. Because that's a statement, right? His questioning tone and pause lead you to quickly nod, and he continues, "Like I mentioned earlier, that place was a world fragment, which is a sort of incomplete reality." He gestures vaguely with his free hand at the word incomplete. It seemed endless, but if you'd tried to walk away without using the wayside, that's how Jazz brought you out, you probably wouldn't have been able to get very far from where you woke up. Maybe not more than a few paces past the base of that hill, even given how homogeneous the fragment was. These sorts of fragments naturally occur in the inner radius, which is a part of the broader cosmos, on the border between the annulus and the abyss. He paused to take a sip of water. The annulus is a collection of worlds, complete ones, including the one we're in right now, while the abyss is a sort of soup of dissolved world atoms. Fragments like the one you woke up in happen when annular worlds begin to break down when exposed to the abyss, or when world atoms from the abyss begin to crystallize together due to perturbations in... Sorry, you interrupt, but this is a lot to take in at once. Yeah, that's what I was thinking as well. Like I said, a reader does want to know what's going on, and the best way to tell them what's going on is piece by piece, right? Because then you don't have all this front-loaded exposition, right? There's got to be a more seamless way for a reader to come to understand all this than just having one character say it all in a big block of dialogue, right? And it is good that the subject here is interrupting this speaker, Luke, so that they can, get some context, because the reader definitely needs some context here. I will say, this is very well written. I really like the writing style personally, besides sort of the ellipses that are here and there. I do wish the narration were just a tiny bit more streamlined, but for the most part, I actually really like a lot of what's going on here. And the only thing that is keeping me from kind of wanting to read on is just the fact that, like, the explanations are sparse so far. And then once we do get an explanation, there's just way too much to take in, right? So just kind of like I've been saying this whole time, there's got to be a more engaging way to do this sort of thing. You got to sneak in the answers little by little, so that your reader can follow along piece by piece, right? And it's okay for them to still have questions, but there's got to be enough to latch onto. It's like writing a mystery novel, right? There's got to be clues interspersed throughout. You even think about, like, Scooby-Doo, for example. Scooby-Doo is great because they give you a clue to work with as you keep going, right? And up until the culprit is unmasked, there is something for you to be working with the whole time, right? It's not just a bunch of clues, then a bunch of bullcrap, and then we get to the end. Not to say, no, nothing in this story is bullcrap, I'm sure it all serves a much larger purpose. But basically what I'm saying is, it sounds silly, but kind of make it a little bit like Scooby-Doo, right? Give something for your detectives, your readers, to latch onto little by little, so that they don't start tuning out when there isn't enough of a clue, but so that they also don't start tuning out when there are too many clues, right? And like I said this earlier, this is a very hard line to walk, but it really seems like there's an interesting mythology being created here in this story. And it's like a class that you take, right? Like when you're in a college class, a high school class, even in elementary school, you got to take it little by little, right? If you're learning how to analyze poetry, you don't necessarily start with Emily Dickinson, right? You start with, nothing gold can stay. That's a very simple poem for like a middle schooler to analyze. And then eventually, as they get into it a little bit further, then you can give them some of Dickinson's harder stuff, right? Anyway, this is all I'm trying to say, is you have a great world here. It looks like you have some cool characters too. What's going to make the reader latch on to all of it? Yeah, that's all I'm trying to say. I also question, why is this in second person? Why not make the subject like a real character rather than just a you, right? Because, and again, we haven't read this whole thing. Maybe there's more to it than what we've read so far. But it sounds like there should be a backstory for them, right? Anyway, that's just my thinking. But there is a lot of really good stuff going on here. I just want the author to consider, how they're meeting out the crucial points of lore. How are those being divided? Yeah. But I do want to thank you for that submission, because like I said, a lot of really interesting stuff there, really cool world building. And so I do hope that goes somewhere. All right, we got another poem. This is a poem by a published author. It's called Having a Word by Benjamin Zephaniah. I'm always thrilled when people submit their own original work. I will always read that for sure. But it's cool to have work submitted by somebody else for somebody else, if that makes sense. So this was not submitted by Benjamin. This was submitted by, I assume, a fan of Benjamin's, right? So this poem's called Having a Word. I think there was a content warning mentioned. Yeah, discussion of politics and general oppression. So be conscious of that. I have learnt that equality may not mean freedom, and freedom may not mean liberation. You can vote, my friend, and have no democracy. Being together, dear neighbor, may not mean unity. Your oppressors may give you chances, but no opportunities, and the state that you are in may have its state security. Yet you may be stateless without protection. You, my friend, do not have to follow your leader. The government does not have to govern you. I'm telling you, Mom, you are greater than the law, if you are just when the law is not. You see, once you are aware that new labor does not care for the old workers, you may also know that change may not mean revolution. Once you realize that old conservatives are running out of things to conserve, you may also know that all politicians suck the same. Babylon must burn. Burn, Babylon, burn. Politics is like this. Life is like this. Intelligence may not mean intelligent. The news may not be new. From where we are, to be awake may not mean to be conscious. Ooh, wow, there's a lot of really good stuff going on in there. So the operative device here is sort of this parallelism, this repeated phrase, X may not mean Y, that sort of thing, right? Like in the first and second line. Equality may not mean freedom, and freedom may not mean liberation. And then later we have being together, dear neighbor, may not mean unity. And then there's a little bit more at the end, right? Intelligence may not mean intelligent, that sort of thing. So that's a cool device, and it doesn't sound too repetitive, just based on the subjects being compared. At the same time, though, it is, the first thing I noticed in the poem. So there's that. I like the way the poem sounds in a lot of areas. It reads really smoothly, right? I have learnt that equality may not mean freedom, and freedom may not mean liberation. You can vote, my friend, and have no democracy. That's a good way to break the repeated phrases, right? Because Benjamin Zephaniah could have written it as voting may not mean democracy, but instead he chose to write it as you can vote, my friend, and have no democracy. So that's a good lesson in keeping the poem with some vitality, right? Because as I've said many, many times, too many repeated phrases over and over, it's kind of a slog. It kind of makes the reader just want to hurry rather than linger. And so by breaking that sort of monotony, it encourages you to really consider all the lines, right? So anyway, moving on. Being together, dear neighbor, may not mean unity. Your oppressors may give you chances, but no opportunities. Great rhyme, and it keeps going. And the state that you are in may have its state security, yet you may be stateless without protection. So as with previous poems we've seen in this video, I do kind of question, like, why is the rhyme scheme inconsistent? And with these videos, I usually don't delve into that, just for the sake of time more than anything. Here, and with the previous, with all the poems we've looked at, there may be a purpose to that. I won't delve into it, but as with the previous poems we looked at, it almost makes me wish just kind of that the whole poem rhymed, right? Because unity and opportunities and security, those are good rhymes. And so it just kind of makes me wish this whole piece were rhyming, but, I'm not the artist, so. And I do like all these juxtapositions where it's like, how is voting not the same as democracy? How is freedom not the same as liberation? How is equality not the same as freedom? How are chances not the same as opportunities, etc.? So there's really a lot to chew on with this poem, just in the comparing of all of these different words. And the state that you are in may have its state security, yet you may be stateless without protection. I think a lot of people would share in that sentiment, right? A lot of people don't stand for the Pledge of Allegiance because it says liberty and justice for all. And a lot of people don't think that there is liberty and justice for all in this country, right? That's obviously a United States specific example, but it's like, until the United States protects me, why should I feel like I'm part of the United States, right? And that's a question that any person in any state can answer, right? If my state doesn't represent me, why would I call myself a member of that state? If anything, I should be stateless, right? That's what I think is being said with those lines. You, my friend, do not have to follow your leader. The government does not have to govern you. I'm telling you, Mom, you are greater than the law if you are just when the law is not. So there's two ways to read that line, which is really interesting. You could read it as, if you are just when the law is not, as in if you have a sense of justice when the law doesn't. Or you could read this line as, if you are just when the law is not. So if you exist even when the law is not, right? Even when the law is not existing. And that's a really cool dichotomy there. Both of those phrases both have their own sense of weight to them. Both of those interpretations of each phrase, I should say, or of the one phrase. So I like that there's a paragraph break here, because before, we have this idea that systems aren't always what they say they are. And here we have this idea that because systems aren't what they say they are, you don't have to be what systems say you are either, right? You don't have to follow your leader. If the government doesn't govern you, then why should you let it, right? That's a really cool message of like standing against systems, right? You see, once you are aware that new labor does not care for the old workers, you may also know that change may not mean revolution. Wow, there's a lot to be had there. Once you are aware that new labor does not care for the old workers, you may also know that change may not mean revolution, right? Yeah, because like, for example, again, is the United States-centric way of thinking, but, as corporations went out of business and new corporations took their place, there was change, but did things actually get better for workers? No, not really. Not at all, right? Like Amazon is what comes to mind. Yeah, I mean, there's no better way to put it than Zephaniah already has in the poem, right? Moving on. Once you realize that old conservatives are running out of things to conserve, you may also know that all politicians suck the same. I thought the phrase was funny, but also, there's, again, a lot to be had here. Not just that they, suck in the sense that, boo, politicians suck, but also what is it that they're sucking, right? Like a vampire, like the blood life of society, kind of, right? And then I also like the way he takes the word conservative and breaks it down into, the root of the word, conserve. That's like a strategy that Amanda Gorman will do a lot, for example, but she does it usually a lot more explicitly than just kind of a one-line mention. But here I think it works well. It does all that it has to do in just these 2 lines. And then we have the biblical reference to Babylon. I might be wrong about this. I try to keep up with my biblical symbolism because, it's so prevalent in Western literature, but I'm pretty sure Babylon is like the anti-chosen people, right? Like you have the Jews, God's chosen people, and then you have Babylon, who are the anti-Jews. And so when Zephaniah says Babylon must burn, burn, Babylon, burn, it is to say we have to get rid of, these evil systems, right? And then moving on, politics like this, life is like this. Politics is like this, life is like this. So this is, dialect, right? Because obviously if you were to write this phrase with complete grammatical correctness, you would say politics are like this, THIS. So this is a good way to explicitly inject one's voice into a poem, is to use dialect, right? But if you don't have a dialect, like me, for example, or at least, I guess I should say everyone has a dialect, right? If you have a dialect that, sounds pretty in line with the majority of Western literature, like me, I guess is what I should say, because I am, sort of the prototypical Westerner at this point. If that's the case, then obviously you can't really inject, a non-Western dialect into your poem. So, bummer, but, there are other ways you can inject your own voice into poetry, right? Intelligence may not mean intelligent. Because, intelligence does have more than one meaning, right? And one of them is not intelligent. Intelligence can mean, reconnaissance, information gathered by spying or whatever, or through military action. So, anyway, that's what comes to mind with that phrase. The news may not be new. Yep, absolutely. From where we are, to be awake may not mean to be conscious. Now, that stanza strikes me because, the word woke is, really in the zeitgeist right now. And that's, what it meant initially, the word woke. It meant to be conscious, right? Correct me if I'm, mistaken on that. But, when folks said stay woke, it was to say be conscious of, the actions that police take against black people. It meant in every way, that the system would torment and abuse minorities, right? Anyway, sorry. There's a lot to be had with this poem. This was really good. I like this a lot. Again, kind of my only gripe with it is I wish there were more rhyme, because the rhyme that was used here was super cool. So I wish I could have seen more of that here. But gosh, what a masterclass in poetry that both sounds really great and then also says more than it appears to say, right? Because on its face, each line does kind of say exactly what it is saying, but then there are lines where you can draw more from it, right? Just kind of like this line that we looked at, if you are just when the law is not. So really, really cool stuff here. That was awesome. I believe that was Zagreus who submitted that one too, so thank you for introducing me to that. I'll have to look more into Zephaniah's work. And that's going to take us to the last one for today. Excuse me. This is another piece of prose, a little short story by Jude, and you can see that their work is on Substack, mmjude.substack.com. I'm going to have a little water before we jump into this one. So there was no content warning here, but there was a note from the author. The author said, "This is actually an unfinished short story, as you'll see by the scene break at the end. I'm very intrigued in prose, especially the more poetic types. I like the idea of being a stylist, so sometimes I ignore grammatical rules so as to not disturb the rhythm of a sentence." Okay. My literary influences are Cormac McCarthy, William Faulkner, Toni Morrison, and Flannery O'Connor. However, if you're familiar with McCarthy's work, I think you'll see a lot more of his influence than any other. I worry sometimes I try to copy him too much. The title is actually a line from a Dr. Seuss poem. I did not know that. It's night before it's afternoon. Cool. Okay, as with the previous prose work, we'll see kind of how far we get into this. I don't want to spend too much time on it. It is double-spaced, so it might, look a little longer than it actually is, but let's just get into it. The plastic arm of a mobile hung plush giraffes and elephants and zebras above the bassinet. Okay. It's kind of a tough sentence to open on. I know the author said they sometimes break grammatical convention, but I don't think the flow justifies the breaking there. So hang on, let me reread that. The plastic arm of a mobile hung plush giraffes and elephants and zebras above the bassinet. So I think by mobile, it means a baby carrier, right? Or the things that hold toys above a baby's crib. I think the word hung is what's getting me here. Yeah, because it sounds like the arm is the thing that's being hung, but the arm is what's doing the hanging, right? So, okay, it does make sense grammatically. The plastic arm of a mobile hung plush giraffes and elephants and zebras above the bassinet. Look, maybe it's just me who struggled with that first sentence. Maybe I was just confused. But at the same time, maybe there's a way to rewrite that so that it is a little less confusing. For example, the plastic arm of a mobile held plush giraffes and elephants and zebras above the bassinet. I don't know. Maybe that's just me. If anybody else had trouble with that, let me know. Her covers were thrown about. She lay prone in the crook of her father's arm while he read from the book in his other hand. A succulent winged pacifier outlined by the shape of a butterfly plugged in her mouth. "I don't care if you believe it," Charlie said. "That's the kind of house we live in, and I hope we never leave it." A little rhyme there, kind of like that. The chair creaked against the floorboards as he rocked. She'd fallen asleep long ago, but he continued to read to her. He closed the book and looked down at Cynthia and smiled. One of these days, he won't get to read to her like this, but that day is not today, and it won't come tomorrow either. Okay, so right off the bat, we, have a sense of what's going on here. It looks like we've got a father and a daughter, a baby, right? That's kind of another thing I want to mention about the first line is I don't know that that's really a hook, personally. So on top of being, a little bit hard to decipher, I don't know that necessarily draws a reader in. So that's just something else to consider. So let's just keep going now that we have some context. He set the book on the nightstand and combed 2 fingers through her blonde hair. Fiona walked into the doorway and leaned against the jamb with folded arms and watched them. "I don't think she gets what you're reading to her," she said. There should be a comma at the end of quotations like this. Down here too. "Sometimes those are the best books to read," he said. She walked over to him and ran her fingers through his coarse hair. He looked up at her. There were bags under her eyes that reflected his own. He knew she didn't care for them, and he didn't care for his. The creation of life is natural symbiosis. He stood and walked to the bassinet and laid their daughter on the white sheets. The empty chair rocked as if still occupied by some spectral parent and infant from a different lifetime. Ooh. He looked back at Fiona. She tiptoed to him, and they both watched their daughter, looking down into the skylight of the bassinet. Beneath was an ova sculpture, molded and remolded by the hands of spermatozoa The baby's skin still looked as supple as raw clay, deities in their own right, made in their own image. "We should take her to see Grandma this weekend," she whispered. "I thought your sister was going instead," he whispered. "Visiting Mom is tough for her. And your brother? The boys are a handful." "Honey," he said louder. Their daughter moaned, a soft, high-pitched noise. Her diminutive fingers curled into a ball, and she rubbed her pudgy fist against her puffy cheeks and turned her head to the other side. Good descriptors in that sentence. I liked that. She still slept. Charlie took Fiona by the hand and gently led her out of the room. She plucked the baby monitor off the bureau. They sat adjacent to one another on the sectional sofa, the baby monitor equidistant from either of their reach. "Leave is over this week," Charlie said, "and the facility's all the way in Andover." "I know." "Oh, sorry." "You still want to go?" "No," she said, "but I have to." "Do you?" She glared at him, his visage ignited in the reflective white and brown of her eyes. Her pupils morphed into bullet tips. "You know, I have to," she said. Charlie leaned back on the couch and sighed deeply. Okay. I don't know who's speaking at the top of this page because, let's see, the last speaker was the woman, but then we have a new paragraph where Charlie leans back and sighs. And so is Charlie the next one to speak, or is his wife? Fiona, I think is the name, right? Yeah. So, yeah, some dialogue tags would be helpful. It's kind of hard when we have this many pieces of dialogue and 0 tags. Jasmine will come around soon. I'm not so sure. She paused. Okay, so it's Fiona speaking here. It's hard on her to see Mom like that. And what about you? Is it easy? No. I'm hearing a whole lot of no's. I don't think there should be an apostrophe there. I don't think you ever use an apostrophe for plurals. She hasn't had the chance to see the baby yet. I know, Charlie said. I know. He glanced over his shoulder through the sliding French doors. Outside, the grass had thrived a lush green. Blinding had been the vinyl white fence. He caught a glimpse of the square's bone-white 2x4s he'd drilled. Bags of sand were supposed to be delivered yesterday. Charlie looked back at Fiona and saw the rims of her eyes were red and her cheeks wet. He took hold of her hand. I'm sorry. No, she sniffles. I think it's supposed to be past tense. No, you're right. I'll take the next few days off and we can go. I just don't know anymore. What don't you know? If I did the right thing, making Mom wait this long. We weren't ready. Besides, the boys are more than enough. She always wanted Jasmine and I to try. Jasmine had every opportunity with Frank. The man adored her enough. She said it wouldn't have worked. I will say before we move on. So initially we got the context, right? It was a father with his baby, and this woman, Fiona, seems to be his wife, right? And they're talking about visiting Fiona's mother, it looks like. This stuff about, like, what was her name? Jasmine. That's a little hard to keep track of. I don't know. We'll probably get more details on that as we go, but yeah, with all this dialogue, it is a little hard just keeping up as a reader, but we'll keep going. We'll bear with it. We'll take it on its own terms for now. He paid off her credit card debt, all of it. He just wasn't the right man for something like that. Charlie smiled. Who is? Fiona faintly grinned back at him and traced her feathery fingers along his hand. She just wanted a daughter for her daughter, another woman like her. Charlie leaned over and put a hand over her cheek. She squeezed it and pressed it against herself. Do you want to bring Cynthia to her this weekend? She looked into his face. The lumps beneath his eyes cast a dark pool, like the bleary dark shadows of hills at the sun's meridian. Beneath the thin veil of his... I've read this word before, but it always trips me up. Indefatigability was an exhaustion more dogged than hounds lolling in the shade on the summer solstice. She saw it. She felt it herself. She wanted to cast it aside. It's fine, she said. He looked at her with hard eyes. We'll go next weekend. Rosie's a strong woman, he said. Cynthia, again, like the dialogue tag would have been nice here because she says something, he does something, and then I don't know who's speaking after that, but then it becomes clear after. Rosie's a strong woman, he said. Cynthia will get to grow up with her Nona. She cast her eyes down and nodded. Next week. Yeah, next week. Next week never came, nor the following week. Cynthia took a fever soon after this. Fiona delayed her start date. Her mother's health declined steadily. Soon enough, even Fiona searched for excuses to delay her visits, and she certainly didn't include Cynthia due to her mother's exasperation and pitiful behavior. For how should the psyche react when the mind and body betray it worse than a Shakespearean tragedy? So that's a lot that just happened in that one paragraph, but again, we'll bear with it. We'll see where it goes. Just like, you know, that could have been a lot of character developing stuff in there that was kind of just glossed over, but we'll see. On the eve of her mother's death, a trip to hospice was paid, where her mother drifted into a slumber mediated by the hands of distant chemists. Surrounding her were those she sired. There she lay in her linen cocoon, her eyes closed and her jaw agape and slanted, drawing in sharp, harsh breaths like winds prepping to shout to heaven, to parley with God himself. Circled around the bed were her children, like practitioners to their pantheon, who joked and tailed another, and though their voices touched her ears, they were drowned out by either saintly hymns or crackling hellfire. Beside them were children who looked upon their matriarch, unable to gauge their sadness, for the prospect of death overwhelmed them. It was here that her grandchildren first understood that the Reaper was not only of their realm, but resides in corporeal dwellings, and when the flesh of vitality dissolves, its osseous face materializes from the ashes like some necromancing phoenix. Okay, pretty good simile. One thing I want to say, the author did mention, they don't always stick to grammatical conventions. Sometimes those conventions are necessary, right? There isn't a period here, and that looks to be more of a mistake than a conscious choice because all the other sentences end with periods. But if every sentence didn't end with a period, if it just ended with this kind of blank space, that would be hard for a reader, right? Especially if you were to submit this to, a journal or something. The reader would probably not look at it very seriously for that reason. But yeah, anyway. So just, it's okay to break the rules every once in a while, but sometimes the rules exist for a reason, of course. Moving on. However, though these events are immutable, Charlie and Fiona could not foresee this. Time is both quantitative and qualitative, but clocks are its only informants. Okay, so looks like we might be playing with narrative structure and present versus past tense. We'll see. Evening swept over Charlie and Fiona's house. The night was still between the twinkling stars and the grasshoppers. The night was still between the twinkling stars, and the grasshoppers sought refuge in their green blades and croaked shrilly a psalm of rustling legs. Right, because if we don't have the comma, we think this sentence between the twinkling stars and the grasshoppers, we think the night is between those two things rather than just between the stars, so you need that comma there. Charlie walked barefoot about the house, switching off lights. He crept in the nursery and leaned into the bassinet, and kissed his daughter's soft forehead and turned off the lamp. He entered his room and crawled into bed. Fiona fell asleep long ago. The baby monitor near her nightstand. He leaned over and kissed her cheek and extinguished the light from his lampshade and slept. Charlie awoke once in the night to get water and went back to bed and woke once more. He swung a trembling arm over to Fiona. An ache flared in his shoulder socket. His arm met the emptiness of the room. His eyes snapped open, attempting to roll over, but he hadn't realized he already lay prone, and moving his body proved difficult. He opened his mouth. His throat was dry. He lashed his tongue over his mouth and felt the dry scales, like pustules, scratch against his sharp, papery lips. When a sound trembled up his esophagus and expelled itself, he didn't recognize its source, imbued with a sort of antiquity and gaushiness. like a voice a gramophone might have played in a time older than he. Sweeping his arms slowly on either side of him, he realized that he now slept in a cot. He eyed the room. Behind a curtain bled an oblong frame of baleful white moonlight, ambience for the black figures erected about him as incongruous and austere as poltergeists. This, I think, is where the story should have began. I think I've said this before multiple times on this channel, but it's always good to start in the middle and then, kind of fill your audience in on what happened after the fact. That was kind of what was happening in the last story that we read, just, before the poem. That story was starting in the middle, essentially, because, something had happened. We didn't have all the context yet, and we expected the author to fill in the gaps. So I think this is a good hook. This is a good opening. And then you could start here and then kind of say, oh, this is where the subject was before he was in this cot and in this weird room, etc. But anyway, moving on. Beside him, a machine exhaled and a stream of air surged into his nostrils. Charlie clumsily prodded his face and felt the cold plastic tube over his lips like a cheap mustache. Pith skin loose around his eyes and cheeks and gullet. Novelty born from a Lovecraftian narrative. Phases in spite of the mind knowing. The fetus becomes an infant when ripped from the familiar womb. The birth of consciousness. Where the world and its infinite forces, where the world in its infinite terror forces itself upon the child, and the babe's only recourse is to shriek with trembling uvula. Kind of a weird paragraph. I understand the metaphor, but yeah, it's just kind of a lot going on there. Charlie tried to yell. He called for Fiona, for Cynthia. In that alien voice he didn't recognize, unknown even to himself. Tears bubbled in the corners of his eyes, the wet caught in the valley of his wrinkles as they sizzled down his cheeks. Then came another unfamiliar voice. "What?" Charlie said. "Shut up." "What?" "It's time for bed, Charlie." "Who are you?" Then came a click. He heard a woman's voice. "What's the matter?" she said. "He's at it again." "Charlie? Who else?" Within the blackness, the voices kept speaking to one another. Yeah, so like I said, this is pretty gripping, right? This would make for a pretty good opening. Anyway, moving on. It didn't occur to Charlie that what he saw was a curtain until he heard the metallic rings scrape along the pipe. Revealed to him now, a doorframe wrought with harsh yellow light that casted itself on the tile floor. A spill of it touched the foot of a bed. A small woman now stood before him with dark-colored scrubs. Her hawkish face beleaguered by shadows. She looked at him as if he should be first to speak. "What's wrong, Charlie?" "Where am I?" "Christ," the other man said. The woman snapped her head to the bed behind her. Her ponytail whipped about her head like a tassel. She looked back at Charlie. "Everything will be fine. You're in a safe place." "Fiona," Charlie said. "Where's Fiona?" The woman took several steps forward and knelt next to his bed. She cradled his hand in her delicate fingers. She feathered his knuckles with her thumb. It reminded him of Fiona's. Before him, in fleeting fever dream clarity, were her hands on his, only to be dispelled by the shriveled, withered, bony fingers he now possessed. He met this woman's soft eyes. "Your wife's been gone for a long time. Will she be back?" She paused. "Will she?" "No, Charlie, I don't think she will." He tore his hand away from her. Charlie closed his eyes to squeeze away tears that leaked down his cheeks and off his chin. His mouth quivered and morphed downward. This melpomene retching, some moan of visceral anguish for his losses. Okay, so just to take a guess real quick of what's happening. So earlier the narrator said something about time being, kind of loose, whatever. It sounds like Charlie here is slipped into a future time where he's much older. And these two people are perhaps nurses comforting him, trying to comfort him. They probably think he's a mental patient or something. Sounds like that's what's happening, which is pretty Twilight Zone-ish. I like it. But let's, keep going. The woman slowly stood. "I'm sorry," she whispered. She turned to walk to the door with downcast eyes. As she plodded back to the door, the sheets crackled in the adjacent bed, and she glanced over at it. Should be at it. The elderly man in the bed groaned, rubbed his eyes, and scowled. Just might want to tell him he didn't have a wife next time, he said. Oh, okay. Didn't have a wife, so maybe Charlie's even in somebody else's body, or, he is an old man and he's misremembering his past entirely. I don't know. We'll see. She grasped the handle and the yellow hall light waned, like a lunar eclipse born in spring, until the last bits of saffron spread away, sallying forth an unencumbered dark where sobs fell deftly. The drapes were drawn and the windows open, and the afternoon soon poured in with the summer's dry scent. Pine needles and Bermuda grass cut Julian from the pulsing lawnmowers. High in the corner, perched like a bird of prey, the television set droned some rerun from a previous era, where actions relive their vivacity. Outside of this recursive algorithm, they and their spectators of the same epoch fade with every new birth certificate, every grave mark. The theory of culture shift inferred from its wake, where cemeteries trail like stardust. Charlie sat upright in his bed. He stared out the window, fiddling restlessly with the edge of a powder blue comforter that dressed his lower body, as though he were troubled in the study of this window. In silent contemplation of his working thesis, the window being some portal, an aperture in time, back to his native realm. Beside him, the dividing curtain was bunched against the wall, the other half of the room now open to him, though it was not solely Charlie's domain. The man in the adjacent bed was named Harold, but preferred Harry, bald down to the ears, where his hairline fuzzed the circumference of his head. Perhaps the wrinkles of his face painted his resting frown, or perhaps it was the invert. Clavicles bulged from his neck like ossified veins. Charlie and he rested like kings of partitioned land, where Harry dared to strike down any trespassing missionary. He, with his pugnacious mug, stared at the television, then side-eyed Charlie, the reverer. None of it's about to change, he said. What isn't? Whatever it is you're thinking of. Wrong form of you're there. I'm not thinking anything. Everyone has something to think of. What are you thinking, then? Charlie asked. He turned his head to Harry. Harry returned a frown. Shut up and watch the TV. I wasn't talking before. You are now. Charlie looked back out the window. A breeze caught the drapes, and they ballooned and drifted away from the sill. He looked back at Harry. How'd I get here, he asked. How should I know? How long have I been here? Only can say for as long as I have. And what's that? 3 months. When they rolled me in, you were looking at me with that same face you're giving now. Charlie furrowed his brow and poked his face with his fingers. Did we know each other? Jesus Christ, you sure are chatty this time around. Harry raised his arm toward the television and squeezed the clicker in his hand. The black box squealed to a different program with figures colored black and white. A woman in dark scrubs walked in. She wore a blue mask over her nose and chin, black hair tied in a sloppy bun atop her head. Beneath her violet glasses were piercing aquatic eyes scrunched in the indication of a smile. How's the afternoon treating you, Harry? She said. Harry nodded. Marissa. The nurse glanced at Charlie and greeted him. Charlie exchanged pleasantries in an unsure manner. She rolled in a stool next to Harry's bed. You know the drill. I remember, Harry groaned. The nurse removed the pillows from his back as Harry adjusted himself so he laid more flat on the bed. She held a button on the electric pendant while the bed whirred and lowered to an almost level position. Harry raised his arms above his head. Marissa lifted his gown. Tagged against his skin was a yellow-brown stained bag shaped like a pear. Next to this, a long, vertical, pallid scar divided his belly button, contrasting brilliantly with his dark skin like a paling constellation in the black night sky. Anything new? She said. Only thing to do here is waste away, Harry said. What about you, Charlie? She glanced up at Charlie. He shrugged. What's wrong? He's reset, Harry said. Again? Yeah, keeping me from a good night's sleep. Time frame's getting a lot shorter lately. She snapped on a pair of purple latex gloves and placed a silver bedpan near Harry's feet. Inside the bag was what looked like curdled excrement. The nurse ripped open a package of square, packaged square of an antiseptic wipe. With one hand, she delicately peeled the bag off as she wiped the newly exposed flesh. The rank smell of feces wafted. Okay, I question the necessity of this scene. Like, I get it. They're old people. They, can't do tasks the way younger people can. I just wonder why it has to be this exactly to show that. Upon his stomach was a bright red bulb, an enlarged pock, the ileal protuberance, viscera never sought outside a surgeon's watchful eye. She dropped the bag in the bedpan and tore a second square, prodding with it the skin around the pink node, hands dancing with the dexterity of a bar magician. Next to the bedpan was a similar bag to the disposed one, though more pristine, minted with the scent of plastic and antibacterial. Stripping the paper from the adhesive as she placed its beige mouth around the cherry on his lower abdomen, at the center of this new plastic window popped the brightened, ruddy stoma like some grotesque bullseye. She lowered his gown. The nurse gathered the ribboned paper from the bed. Wipes stained with an opaque brown were already in the bedpan. She rose and walked into the bathroom, and a flush swished about their room. Marissa emerged and walked to a garbage can donned in the bright yellow biohazard symbol and stepped on a pedestal, springing forth the lid and dumped the contents inside. She ambled over to Charlie, asked him to sit up, fluffed his pillow, then retreated towards the door. Okay, so, I get it. It's supposed to be a little visceral, a little bit gross, right? But, to what end, right? What did that scene do for us? I kind of question its inclusion, personally. Thematically, I'm not sure what it was doing there, other than to get, sort of a rise out of the audience. I don't know. Same time tomorrow, Marissa asked, holding the door jamb. I'll keep an eye out, Harry said. She smiled at him and bid Charlie a farewell before exiting. Harry squeezed a button on the pendant. His bed rose mechanically. Once set, he lifted the clicker to increase the volume. Charlie stared at him. I'm sure there are prettier sights than me. What happened to you? Charlie asked. What didn't? Charlie nodded. He plopped his head back on the plump pillow, guffing a puff of air from the case. He returned to the window, side-eyed by Harry. What's your problem? Harry asked. How do you mean? I'm saying you're acting funny. Just yesterday I was a young man, then I woke up like this. How should I act? Harry raised his brows and torqued his head in a non-committal gesture. Sure can feel like that sometimes, Harry said. He pointed the clicker at the black box and a new program frizzled upon the screen. And that's where it ends for now. I believe the author did say this was unfinished. Yeah, an unfinished short story. Okay, so one thing to note, that story again came to us from Jude, and you can check out more of their work at mmjude.substack.com. And I do want to thank them for sharing that. There was a lot of good stuff going on there. Where do you take that story from there? It's an interesting question, I think. Like I said, I compared it to the Twilight Zone, right, where this young man wakes up in an old man's body and his past doesn't, seem to be the way he remembers it, where it seemed like he didn't actually have a wife, and if that's true, did he actually have a daughter, right? Yeah, I'm not sure where you go from there. It's hard to say, since I'm not the person who wrote the first portion of it. I guess, the question would be, what does Charlie do now? Does he try to find a way back? And if so, where does that lead him? Does he uncover a conspiracy where he was right all along, or is he actually insane? I think the former is a lot more interesting, though you could still make a lot of implications toward the latter, right? Yeah, and sort of leave the reader with the question of, well, how much of that was actually real? It's classic horror in the modern day, really. There are a lot of directions you could take that. I think simply, if you're asking for advice on writer's block by sending this story in, I think simply the question to ask is, what does Charlie do next? And maybe that sounds like too simple of a question, or maybe there are too many answers to that question, or maybe not enough answers, right? if writer's block is the issue, I would encourage you to just work on something else for a little bit while, and then come back to this story after perhaps having gained some new perspective by working on something else. If anyone has any suggestions on where that should go, that would be cool to discuss in the comments. Like I said, it's Twilight Zone-ish, and the Twilight Zone usually kind of has a twist to it, where in this story, maybe the twist is like, Charlie, I don't know. It's hard, right? It's hard to think of a unique twist just, from thin air, but, if it were an episode of the Twilight Zone, I kind of see it going in this direction of like, Charlie, he keeps talking about, the past that he knew, and maybe he won't stop talking about it. Maybe Harry tries to warn him to stop talking about it, but he doesn't. And so Harry, for some reason, maybe gets taken away, and Charlie's left alone. And then maybe, some men in suits come and talk to Charlie about what's going on. And maybe there's just sort of this implication, right, that like Charlie was right all along, but for some reason the past is being kept from him. And maybe you can delve into like what might have happened and why his memory is being suppressed. It could be sort of Black Mirror-ish almost. Those are some initial thoughts, just thinking about it as if it were a Twilight Zone episode, right? So anyway, thank you guys for joining me as always on the second channel here. Some really great works today. I want to give a huge thanks again to Zagreus and Aabcehmu and Benjamin Zephaniah, even though he didn't, send in his poem himself, and to Jude, of course. So thank you guys all for your works. Really good reads, awesome stuff. And I hope everybody has a great week and takes it easy.